Madam Former Speaker, allow me to direct your attention back to the morning of December 15th, 2020. On that specific date, you were present at a highly classified briefing regarding Operation Warp Speed and the logistical plans for vaccine distribution. Later that very same afternoon, your husband, Paul, purchased call options on Pfizer stock, valued at $5 million. The very next day, the FDA publicly announced emergency use authorization for the Pfizer vaccine, causing the stock to soar. In a span of just 48 hours, your husband cleared a profit of $3.7 million, a timing so precise it defies belief. FBI Director Kash Patel's voice cut through the air of the House Oversight Committee room, steady and clinical. He sounded like a seasoned prosecutor who had spent months meticulously assembling a fortress of evidence and knew it was impenetrable. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the room, weighing down on everyone present. Nancy Pelosi sat at the witness table, flanked by a phalanx of high-priced defense attorneys in bespoke suits. Now 85 years old and no longer the speaker, she still carried the air of authority that came from being the most powerful woman in American politics for 20 years. She wore her signature St. John suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, wearing the armor of a woman who had stared down presidents and survived every political skirmish. Yet, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere today, a tension that hadn't been there before. She looked uncomfortable, perhaps even trapped, as if realizing this wasn't just another partisan hearing. Director Patel hadn't arrived with empty political rhetoric or grandstanding accusations. He had brought the receipts, trading logs, phone records, time-stamped congressional calendars, and bank statements. This was the kind of hard, empirical evidence that no amount of political spin could make disappear. Although the hearing was officially closed to the public, the room was packed to capacity with committee members, staffers, and investigators. Cameras were rolling to preserve the testimony for the congressional record, capturing every uncomfortable shift and bead of sweat. Outside the heavy oak doors, the press corps waited like a school of sharks, sensing blood in the water. This was originally billed as a routine inquiry into stock trading reform, a mundane procedure. Republicans had retaken the House in the 2024 elections and had immediately launched a series of investigations into various matters. Pelosi had testified before Congress dozens of times over her 4-decade career and expected this to be nothing more than political theater. She anticipated easy deflections and the usual partisan bickering she could navigate with her eyes closed. Instead, she had walked blindly into a full-scale prosecution because Patel had done something unprecedented. He had actually traced the flow of money, mapped the timelines, and built a criminal case. Pelosi's lead attorney, Marcus Stein, the sort of lawyer who billed $2,000 an hour, leaned forward to interject. Director Patel, my client's husband operates independently and makes his own investment decisions without her involvement, he stated firmly. Mrs. Pelosi is not involved in his day-to-day trading activities, Stein insisted, trying to establish a firewall. Your client's husband is 85 years old, Patel interrupted, his voice smooth but cutting. He holds a business degree from Georgetown that dates back to 1965, and he is neither a professional trader nor a financial analyst. Yet somehow, over the last 15 years, he has executed 138 stock trades within a week of your client receiving classified briefings. Patel let that number hang in the air for a moment. 138 trades with an average return of 41%. Warren Buffett, arguably the greatest investor in history, has averaged a return of 20% over his entire career. Paul Pelosi is apparently twice as talented as Warren Buffett, but only on specific trades, Patel noted with a dry irony. Let that statistical impossibility sink in for a moment, he said, scanning the faces of the committee members. On trades where your client possessed inside information, his returns were astronomical. However, on trades where she had no informational advantage, Paul Pelosi's average return was a meager 8%, slightly below the market average. So, he is either a below-average investor who occasionally strikes gold through sheer luck, or he is trading on non-public information provided by his wife. I ask you, which of these explanations makes more logical sense? Patel extracted a document from his binder and slid it across the table toward the witness. Let me illustrate the pattern for you, he began, pointing to the data. In March 2020, Mrs. Pelosi attended a classified briefing regarding the severity of COVID-19 and its looming economic impact. The briefing detailed just how catastrophic the situation was going to be, information the public did not yet have. 2 days later, Paul Pelosi sold off $5 million in airline, hotel, and cruise line stocks. 1 week later, the global economy shut down, and those sectors crashed violently. By selling when he did, he avoided over $2 million in losses that average investors were forced to absorb. Here is another document from June 2021. Patel continued, producing another sheet. Mrs. Pelosi was in closed-door negotiations concerning the infrastructure bill. She knew exactly which companies were slated to receive government contracts, information that was not yet public. 1 day later, Paul purchased $2 million in Caterpillar and Tesla stock. 2 weeks later, the infrastructure bill passed, containing provisions that specifically favored those exact companies. He made a profit of $1.8 million on that transaction alone. Then there is November 2021, when Mrs. Pelosi was working on the semiconductor subsidies bill. Paul bought $4 million in NVIDIA call options just before the legislation moved forward. The bill passed months later, funneling billions in subsidies to chip makers, and he made $3.2 million. Patel looked up from his documents, his eyes locking onto Pelosi. 138 times, Madam Former Speaker. Every single time you possessed advanced information about legislation, government contracts, or regulatory decisions, your husband traded on it. That is not a coincidence. That is not luck. That is a systematic insider trading on a massive scale. Pelosi's face was flushed, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. She had been in the political arena since before Patel was even born. She had survived attacks from the Tea Party, the Trump presidency, and countless ethics complaints. She had always emerged victorious through a combination of political maneuvering, media savvy, and sheer force of will. But this situation was fundamentally different. This wasn't about political narratives or optics. It was about cold, hard mathematics. Timestamps, bank records, and forensic evidence could not be explained away with a clever soundbite. This is nothing more than a partisan witch hunt, she began, her voice tight with strain. This is FBI financial forensic analysis, Patel countered calmly, cutting off her deflection. These are subpoenaed bank records, trading logs, phone records, and time-stamped congressional calendars. We have the exact minute you entered classified briefings and the exact minute you called your husband. We have the exact time he called his broker and the exact time the trades were executed. This isn't partisan, Madame Former Speaker. This is evidentiary. Patel pulled out more charts and timelines, laying them out like a royal flush. You and your husband entered Congress in 1987 with a net worth of approximately $5 million. You are now worth $240 million, all while earning a congressional salary that has never exceeded $223,000. Even if you had saved every penny, paid 0 taxes, and had perfect market returns, the math does not work. You could not accumulate $240 million unless you were trading on inside information for 35 years. The room was completely silent now, the weight of the accusation hanging heavy in the air. Every eye was fixed on Pelosi, every ear tuned to Patel's relentless presentation of the facts. "Let me demonstrate to everyone exactly how you accomplished this," Patel said, his voice echoing slightly. "Let me show you 15 years of insider trading laid bare. 138 trades, $140 million in ill-gotten gains, and the phone calls where you passed the information to your husband moments after leaving classified briefings." Pelosi looked at her lawyers, then at the committee members, and finally at the cameras, recording it all for history. For the first time in her long and storied career, she looked exactly like what she was: caught. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to rewind 6 hours. You have to go back to when Nancy Pelosi thought she could handle this situation the way she had handled everything else. 6 hours earlier, she was sitting in her personal office in San Francisco, 3,000 miles away from the Capitol. She was reviewing notes for her testimony, believing she was prepared. It was 8 in the morning Pacific time, and her flight to D.C. was scheduled for noon. She had 4 hours to prepare for what she assumed would be a routine harassment session by Republicans seeking political points. "They have nothing on us," Pelosi assured her legal team gathered around her desk. Her voice carried the confidence of a survivor who had weathered 4 decades of political storms. "This is just James Comer trying to grab headlines and make me look bad. There is no crime here. Paul's trades are all disclosed as required by law," she insisted. Marcus Stein, her silver-haired lead attorney, nodded in agreement. "The subpoena is broad, but we have multiple privileges we can invoke," he reasoned. "Spousal privilege protects your private conversations, and legislative privilege protects your work in Congress. We do not have to answer questions about what you discussed with your husband or your legislative strategy." Sarah Kim, another attorney on the team, was reviewing the Stock Act requirements on her laptop. "Stock trading by members of Congress is legal, and spouses are permitted to trade," she noted. "The Stock Act simply requires disclosure within 45 days, and we have checked all of Paul's trades. Some were filed late, but we paid the fines, so nothing was technically illegal." Jennifer Martinez, Pelosi's chief of staff, looked less confident than the lawyers. "What about the timing? Some of these trades look incredibly suspicious," she ventured. "Paul buying Pfizer right before the vaccine approval and selling airlines right before the crash looks bad. The Republicans have been building detailed timelines," she warned. Stein waved his hand dismissively. "Timing isn't proof of anything," he argued. "Sophisticated investors make educated guesses based on publicly available information all the time." Paul reads the Wall Street Journal and watches financial news like everyone else. He is capable of making his own investment decisions without insider information. Pelosi nodded, sipping her coffee, feeling reassured. She had been through worse than this, surviving impeachment inquiries and ethics investigations. She was Nancy Pelosi, the first female Speaker of the House, a titan of American politics. She had stared down Newt Gingrich, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump without blinking. She had navigated Clinton's impeachment, the Iraq War, Obama's health care reform, and Biden's agenda. She had survived it all, and this would be no different. What she didn't know was that while she focused on political survival, Kash Patel was building a criminal case. Patel wasn't interested in a political narrative. He was constructing a steel trap of evidence. 8 months of FBI financial forensics, subpoenas to brokers, and cross-referencing phone records with classified schedules. Patel had done what nobody had bothered to do before. He followed the money with the full resources of the FBI. At that exact moment, 3,000 miles away in Quantico, Patel was reviewing the final evidence package. He sat in a secure conference room with his financial crimes team, surrounded by the fruits of their labor. The walls were plastered with charts showing 15 years of trading data, phone records, and congressional schedules. Everything was color-coded and cross-referenced to show the undeniable correlations. Patel looked every bit the former federal prosecutor he was, a man who built airtight cases against white-collar criminals. His lead investigator, Sarah Chen, stood at a whiteboard covered in complex timelines. She was a former SEC enforcement attorney who had moved to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. She had built cases against hedge fund managers and Ponzi scheme operators, but this was her masterpiece. "Let me walk you through the final package," Chen said, clicking through slides on a screen. "We have 15 years of trading records, totaling 387 trades by Paul Pelosi. We have analyzed each one against Nancy Pelosi's congressional schedule and classified briefing logs." She pulled up a chart that visually demonstrated the correlation. Of those 387 trades, 138 show a clear link to Nancy receiving material non-public information. The pattern is undeniable. The average time between her receiving the info and Paul executing a trade is 2.7 days. It's not the same day, which would be too obvious, nor weeks later when the info would be public. It falls into that specific 2 to 3 day window, the sweet spot for plausible deniability. Patel studied the chart, noting the returns on the suspicious trades averaged 41%. On the other 249 trades where Nancy had no advantage, the average return was 8.2%. This means Paul Pelosi is a below-average investor who miraculously becomes the world's greatest trader when his wife has secrets. That is statistically impossible to explain without the presence of insider trading. Tom Rodriguez, a former prosecutor now working as FBI legal counsel, spoke up. "We also have phone records subpoenaed from both of their carriers. In 64 of the suspicious trades, the exact same pattern appears. Nancy attends a classified briefing, calls Paul within 2 hours, and he calls his broker within an hour of that. The trade executes within 24 hours, like clockwork." He pulled up the call logs for the Pfizer trade on December 15, 2020. Nancy enters the skiff at 9 a.m., leaves at 11:45, and calls Paul at 12:17. That was an 11-minute call, followed by Paul calling his Morgan Stanley broker at 1:03 p.m. The trade executed at 2:30 p.m., $5 million in Pfizer call options. The next day, the FDA announces approval, the stock jumps, and they make $3.7 million. The timing is perfect, impossible to explain without Nancy telling Paul what she learned. Patel reviewed the evidence systematically, knowing this was how he built his reputation. "Give me the top 5 most egregious examples," he said. "The ones that are absolutely impossible to explain away." Chen clicked through the slides, highlighting the most damning instances. Number 5. January 2021, EV tax credits. Paul buys Tesla calls, profit $1.4 million. Number 4. March 2020, COVID economic impact. Paul sells travel stocks, avoids $2 million in losses. Number 3. August 2022, Taiwan visit, Paul buys Nvidia, profit $3.2 million. Number 2. July 2021, infrastructure bill contracts, Paul buys Caterpillar and Tesla, profit $4.8 million. Number 1. December 2020, Pfizer vaccine approval, profit $3.7 million in 48 hours. Patel studied each example. realizing the Pfizer trade was the smoking gun. "The timing is impossible to explain any other way," he muttered. "What about their defenses?" he asked, anticipating the legal battle ahead. Rodriguez had already war-gamed the scenarios. "They will claim Paul is a sophisticated investor, but his non-insider trades prove otherwise. They will claim spousal privilege, but privilege doesn't cover criminal conspiracy. They will claim all trades were disclosed, but disclosure doesn't legalize insider trading. They will claim coincidence, but 138 examples defy the laws of probability." Chen added the final nail in the coffin. "We also have Paul's broker. We gave him immunity in exchange for testimony, and he will confirm Paul specifically mentioned Nancy's information. He kept notes with direct quotes like, 'Nancy says the infrastructure bill will pass.' That is direct evidence of tipping." Patel sat back, satisfied with the strategy. "We start with the impossible math to establish motive. Then we show the pattern to establish the scheme. Then the phone records to prove the mechanism. And finally, the specific examples to make it concrete and undeniable." "She is going to claim this is partisan political persecution," Patel noted. "Let her," Chen replied confidently. "This is math. This is forensic accounting. You can't spin your way out of timestamps." At 11 a.m. Pacific, Pelosi's motorcade left for the airport, and she felt ready. She had her talking points. "My husband makes his own decisions. Everything is disclosed. This is harassment." She felt confident, believing she could run out the clock and bore the press. She had no idea that in 6 hours she would be pleading the Fifth Amendment. She didn't know her attorneys would be in panic mode or that the evidence would be overwhelming. At 2 p.m. Eastern, the House Oversight Committee room filled up. Chairman James Comer entered with his chief counsel, ready to finally unveil the investigation he'd been planning. He had needed actual proof, and Kash Patel had delivered it in spades. Having the FBI director present, the evidence gave the hearing a gravity that partisan accusations lacked. Nancy Pelosi entered at 2:15, looking composed and ready for battle. She took her seat, arranged her notes, and the room settled into an expectant silence. Chairman Comer called the hearing to order, stating the purpose was to examine potential ethics violations. Then he dropped the bombshell. "We have a special witness today, FBI Director Kash Patel." Pelosi's expression flickered for a fraction of a second. She hadn't expected the FBI director. Patel stood, walked to the witness table, and began speaking in his calm, prosecutorial voice. "This is not a political investigation. This is a financial crimes investigation. We have spent 8 months analyzing trading records, phone logs, and congressional calendars. What we found is a systematic pattern of insider trading spanning 15 years, resulting in approximately $140 million in ill-gotten gains." The number hung in the air, silencing the room completely. "How did you and your husband accumulate a net worth of $240 million? Patel asked directly. Pelosi tried to use her prepared answer about hard work and good fortune. Patel interrupted smoothly, pulling up a chart of her net worth over time. "Your net worth was stable until you became Speaker in 2007. Then it exploded, correlating directly with your access to classified information. You cannot turn $11 million in salary and business income into $240 million without an edge. Unless you knew things other investors didn't know." He showed the graph of her wealth, a sharp upward curve starting in 2007. "You started attending classified briefings, and your net worth started exploding." "That is not a coincidence." Pelosi's face flushed. Patel was using math that couldn't be spun. The wealth accumulation directly correlates with your access to classified information. Patel continued, relentless. Before access, normal returns. After access, extraordinary returns. The only explanation is that you were using that information to trade. He opened the section on trading patterns, displaying the color-coded spreadsheet. Of 387 trades, 138 occurred within a week of a classified briefing. Average return, 41%. Compare that to Warren Buffett's 20%. On trades without insider info, your husband averages 8%. How do you explain that he is twice as good as Buffett only when you have secrets? Silence filled the room. There was no good answer. Patel showed the timing pattern. Trades happen 2 to 3 days after briefings. Just long enough for deniability, close enough to capture the gain. He walked through the Pfizer example again, the timelines matching perfectly. You entered the briefing, you called Paul, Paul called the broker, the trade executed. 48 hours later, 3.7 million in profit. Impossible to explain without you telling Paul what you learned. Pelosi tried to claim Paul did his own research. Patel produced Paul's internet search history, showing no professional research tools. He reads the Wall Street Journal and watches CNBC, yet outperforms hedge funds. Let's look at the information flow, Patel said, displaying the call logs. 64 times, the exact pattern repeats. Briefing, call to husband, call to broker, trade. Why the sudden urgency to talk to your husband right after receiving non-public information? He showed the text from Paul to his broker. Need to move fast on Pfizer. Why move fast? Pelosi's lawyer objected, claiming speculation on spousal privilege. It's pattern evidence, Patel countered. At some point, pattern becomes proof. He walked through the 5 most egregious trades again, hammering home the details: the COVID crash, the infrastructure bill, the semiconductor subsidies, the Taiwan visit. In every case, it happened right after you had access to non-public information. These aren't coincidences. This is systematic insider trading. Then Patel played his ace card, the broker's testimony. We gave immunity to Paul's broker, Richard Chen. He testified that Paul specifically said, Nancy says the infrastructure bill will pass. That is direct evidence of tipping. He showed the handwritten notes from the broker. Client says wife attended meetings about AI policy. Client says Nancy indicated regulation will be light. That is your husband telling his broker that you told him about regulatory policy. Pelosi's lawyers were whispering urgently. This was a criminal case, not a political one. Patel tied it all together with a final timeline of wealth accumulation. Your wealth grew exponentially when you had access to classified information. You got information, Paul traded on it, you got rich. That's corruption. The hearing had lasted 5 hours, and Pelosi looked exhausted and cornered. Patel had demolished every defense: the math, the timing, the phone records, the testimony. Chairman Comer leaned forward. How do you explain these coincidences? Pelosi looked at her lawyers. They whispered, and finally she spoke. My husband makes his own investment decisions. Then explain the Pfizer trade, Patel interrupted. What public information led to that trade? Silence. Explain the COVID trades. Silence. Explain why the broker testified that Paul said, Nancy says. Mr. Chairman, these questions call for speculation. Pelosi's lawyer stood up. Your client can invoke privilege, but the American people deserve answers. Comer shot back. Patel stood up. Did you share information from classified briefings with your husband? Long pause. I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The room erupted in gasps. The former speaker was taking the fifth. Patel didn't blink. Let the record reflect the witness has invoked the Fifth Amendment. He asked specifically about each trade, and each time she invoked the fifth. She can't say no because the evidence proves she did. And she can't say yes because that would be admitting a crime. So she takes the fifth. Patel sat down. He had no further questions. Comer looked at Pelosi with pity. The implications are devastating. Pelosi's lawyer tried to argue constitutional rights. This isn't overreach. This is an FBI investigation, Comer interrupted. This committee refers the matter to the DOJ for criminal investigation. We also refer it to the SEC for civil enforcement. And we recommend Congress ban all stock trading by members. The Pelosi case demonstrates exactly why this is necessary. Patel added that the FBI would seek indictments. This is the largest congressional insider trading case in American history. The hearing adjourned, and Pelosi sat motionless. She had walked in confident and walked out destroyed. Taking the fifth was an admission in the court of public opinion. She couldn't explain the unexplainable. The transcript leaked, and the political world went into shock. Nancy Pelosi, the untouchable, had taken the fifth on insider trading. The evidence was too strong, the pattern too clear. The consequences came fast. Criminal investigations, SEC charges, frozen accounts. Pelosi announced her retirement, but nobody believed it was voluntary. Within 3 weeks, both were indicted on 47 counts. The trial was set for April 2026. Paul Pelosi, facing prison at 85, took a plea deal. He agreed to testify against Nancy in exchange for 18 months. Nancy had no choice but to plead guilty as well. Judge Martinez was not sympathetic at the sentencing. "You used your position for personal enrichment," she scolded. "You will serve 8 years in federal prison." Nancy Pelosi entered prison at age 86. Congress passed the Pelosi Act banning stock trading for members. Even her allies voted for it. 6 months later, in a prison interview, Pelosi showed no remorse. "I don't regret the trades, only getting caught," she told the reporter. "We deserve to be wealthy." The interview caused a firestorm, destroying what little support she had left. Paul Pelosi died shortly after his release, broke and broken. Nancy remained in prison, her compassionate release requests denied. Her legacy as a historic legislator was erased, replaced by the scandal. History would remember her for the insider trading that made her millions. The lesson was clear. Public office is a trust, not a trading advantage. Kash Patel had followed the money, and it led straight to the top. The heavy steel door of Cell Block B at FCI Aliceville slammed shut with a finality that echoed like a gunshot in a canyon. Nancy Pelosi sat on the edge of the thin, fire-retardant mattress, staring at the painted cinder-block wall that was now her entire horizon. The transition from the plush velvet of the Speaker's lobby to the sterile, gray coldness of a federal correctional institution was a psychological shock that no amount of legal preparation could mitigate. She smoothed the fabric of her khaki prison uniform, a reflex from decades of straightening designer suits before facing the cameras. Here there were no cameras, no adoring staffers, and no gavel to demand order from the chaos of her new reality. The silence of the cell was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to amplify the beating of her own heart. Across the country, the fallout from her sentencing was tearing through the intricate fabric of Washington's power structure like a wildfire in a dry forest. Kash Patel had not packed up his boxes and gone home after the gavel fell on the Pelosi verdict. Instead, he had turned his attention to the downstream data. The FBI's forensic accounting team had discovered something anomalous in the trading volume surrounding the former speaker's transactions, a pattern that suggested she wasn't acting alone. Millions of dollars in shadow trades had executed milliseconds after Paul Pelosi's orders hit the market, originating from blind trusts held by other high-ranking officials. Patel sat in the same secure conference room in Quantico, the walls now covered with a new web of red string connecting brokerage firms to Senate offices. Pelosi was just the signal flare, Patel told his team, pointing to a cluster of trades involving defense contractors. We have identified 17 other accounts that mirrored her portfolio with 99% accuracy over a 10-year period. These weren't lucky guesses. These were algorithmic trades programmed to follow the queen bee the moment she made a move. We are looking at a syndicated insider trading ring that effectively operated as a private hedge fund for the political elite. The investigation had shifted from a singular prosecution to a systemic purge, threatening to pull the thread that would unravel the entire sweater of the distinct Columbia establishment. In New York, the Southern District prosecutors were quietly issuing subpoenas to 3 major investment banks that had facilitated these shadow accounts. The bankers who had previously dined with senators and arranged campaign fundraisers were now lawyering up, sensing the shift in the wind. The immunity deal given to Paul Pelosi's broker had opened a floodgate of information regarding how the Washington ETF actually functioned. It wasn't just about phone calls, it was a sophisticated network of signals, coded language, and offshore routing designed to evade the very laws Congress had passed. Back in Aliceville, Nancy was learning the brutal hierarchy of the federal prison system, which cared little for her former title or legislative achievements. Her first week was a blur of humiliating processing procedures, medical screenings, and the jarring realization that her autonomy had been completely stripped away. She was assigned a job in the prison library, a cruel irony for a woman who had once written the laws of the nation. Other inmates watched her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, the celebrity of her downfall making her a target for quiet ridicule. She kept to herself, reading legal briefs and writing furiously on yellow legal pads, convinced she could find the loophole her high-priced lawyers had missed. She was still operating under the delusion that this was a temporary political setback rather than the final chapter of her life. Meanwhile, in a sterile interrogation room in downtown D.C., a senior partner from a top-tier lobbying firm was sweating through his Egyptian cotton shirt. Patel was sitting across from him, sliding a photograph of a ledger across the metal table. "We found this in Paul Pelosi's safe deposit box," Patel said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It lists initials, percentages, and offshore account numbers corresponding to the mirrored trades. We know you were the conduit, the man who set up the algorithms for the other members of the syndicate. You can either go down as the mastermind of a RICO conspiracy, or you can give us the names of every politician who bought into the fund." The lobbyist looked at the ledger, then at his attorney, his face draining of color as he realized the depth of Patel's leverage. "If I talk, I'm a dead man," the lobbyist whispered, his voice trembling. "If you don't talk, you're looking at 40 years in a supermax," Patel countered, leaning in closer. "We can protect you, but we cannot protect you from the federal sentencing guidelines if you choose to protect them." The lobbyist cracked, asking for a pen and a fresh pad of paper to begin listing the names. This was the breakthrough Patel had been waiting for, the evidence that would transform the scandal from a Pelosi problem into a Washington catastrophe. The list included powerful committee chairmen, 2 cabinet secretaries, and a handful of federal judges who had mysteriously outperformed the S&P 500 for decades. As the names were transcribed, the scope of the corruption became nauseatingly clear to the investigators in the room. It wasn't just about stocks. It was about land deals near new military bases and pharmaceutical options before FDA rulings. The Pelosi method had been franchisable, sold to a select inner circle who paid a premium for the privilege of front-running the American economy. News of the lobbyists' cooperation leaked within 48 hours, causing a panic in the Capitol that was palpable in the air. Resignation letters began to appear on desks, cited as health reasons or desire to spend time with family. The sudden exodus of entrenched power brokers was the first public sign that the rot was being cut out from the core. In prison, Nancy watched the news on the communal television in the day room, her face impassive as she saw her former allies scrambling for the exits. She realized then that there would be no rescue, no pardon, and no political favor called in to save her. The system she had helped build was cannibalizing itself in a desperate attempt to survive the infection she had exposed. She turned away from the screen, returning to her cell to stare at the ceiling and replay the decisions that had led her here. The hubris of believing she was untouchable had been her true crime, the fatal flaw in a perfectly constructed life. Paul Pelosi, now serving his sentence in a low-security facility in California, was deteriorating rapidly under the weight of his guilt and isolation. His health was failing, and the plea deal that had saved him from a longer sentence had destroyed his marriage and his legacy. He wrote letters to Nancy that were never answered, his handwriting shaky and filled with regret for the greed that had consumed their golden years. The tragic irony was that they had already been wealthy beyond imagination before the illegal trades began. It was never about the money. It was about the thrill of the game, the addiction to having an edge that no one else possessed. Patel's team was now preparing for the Phase 2 indictments, which would target the institutional enablers of the corruption. The investment banks that had looked the other way were facing billions in fines and the potential loss of their charters. The Securities and Exchange Commission, humiliated by the FBI doing their job for them, was forced to launch a parallel civil crackdown. The regulatory landscape of the United States was shifting beneath the feet of Wall Street, ending the era of the congressional exemption. No longer would a seat in the House be viewed as a golden ticket to insider profits. As the months turned into a year, the Pelosi Act began to show its teeth in practice, forcing members to place assets in true blind trusts. The liquidity of the congressional market dried up, and the net worth of serving members began to stagnate, proving just how lucrative the old system had been. The American public, initially cynical, began to see that justice was actually being served in a way they hadn't witnessed in their lifetimes. Kash Patel had become a folk hero to some and a villain to the establishment, a symbol of the wrecking ball that was necessary to rebuild the foundation. But for Nancy, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of a 6x8 cell and the rigid schedule of head counts and cafeteria meals. She had aged a decade in a single year, the stress carving deep lines into a face that was no longer protected by professional makeup and lighting. One afternoon, she was summoned to the warden's office, a rare occurrence that usually signaled bad news or a legal update. Her attorney was there, looking grim, holding a file that contained the rejection of her final appeal to the Supreme Court. The highest court in the land, and including justices she had helped confirm, had refused to hear her case, citing the overwhelming evidence of the lower courts. "It's over, Nancy," her lawyer said gently, closing the file. "There are no more avenues, no more motions. This is the sentence you will serve." The realization hit her with the physical force of a blow to the stomach, knocking the wind out of her remaining defiance. She was not going to make a comeback. She was going to die a federal inmate, a footnote in the history books as a cautionary tale. She walked back to her cell in a daze, the sounds of the prison fading into a dull roar of white noise. That night, she lay awake listening to the breathing of the sleeping woman in the bunk above her, thinking about the gavel. She missed the weight of it in her hand, the sound of it striking the wood, the absolute silence that followed her command. Now she was the one being commanded, told when to eat, when to sleep, and when to stand. The power dynamic had inverted completely, leaving her with nothing but the memories of a reign that had ended in disgrace. The legacy she had obsessively curated was now defined by ticker symbols and trade confirmations rather than legislation. History is written by the victors, and in this financial war, she had been decisively defeated. Outside the prison walls, the country was moving on, the news cycle churning forward into new crises and new leaders. A young generation of representatives was entering Congress, terrified to even own a single stock, fearing the precedent that had been set. The culture of Washington had changed, not because of a change of heart, but because of the fear of consequences. Patel's investigation proved that the law could reach the highest levels if there was a will to enforce it. The Washington ETF was delisted, its operators sanctioned, its assets seized, and its legendary returns erased. 3 years into her sentence, news reached Aliceville that Paul Pelosi had passed away in his sleep at the medical facility in Lompoc. Nancy received the news from the prison chaplain, sitting in a small, windowless room that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. She didn't cry immediately. The shock was a numbing agent that froze her emotions in place. He had been her partner in everything, from the political climb to the financial scheme that destroyed them. His death severed her last tether to the outside world, leaving her truly alone in the hostile environment of the prison. She was denied permission to attend the funeral, a final indignity that underscored her total loss of status. She spent the day of his burial in her cell, staring at a photograph of them from 1987, young and ambitious on the steps of the Capitol. The grief eventually came, a tidal wave of regret that broke her composure and left her sobbing into the rough wool blanket. She realized that the millions they had made were useless now, unable to buy back the time they had lost, or the honor they had squandered. The fortune was gone, seized by the government to pay fines and restitution, leaving their heirs with nothing but the family name and its burden. Kash Patel, having completed his mission, eventually left the FBI to write a book about the investigation, titled The Trust Deficit. It became an instant bestseller, detailing the forensic hunt that had brought down the most powerful woman in politics. He went on book tours, explaining the intricate mechanisms of the insider trading ring to packed auditoriums of outraged citizens. He used the platform to advocate for even stricter term limits and financial controls, ensuring the door remained shut. Nancy read the reviews of the book in a discarded newspaper left in the library, the words stinging like salt in an open wound. Her version of the truth no longer mattered. The public record had been established by the prosecution and cemented by the media. She began to write her own memoir in secret, scribbling on contraband paper, trying to frame the narrative as a misunderstanding of complex finance. But as she wrote, the words felt hollow, the justifications flimsy, even to her own eyes. She couldn't write her way out of the math. The timestamps and the percentages remained stubborn facts that refused to bend. She eventually stopped writing, realizing that silence was the only dignity she had left. The years ground on, marking the passage of time in gray hairs and slower steps. She became an elder in the cell block, a figure of pity rather than power, dispensing advice on legal forms to younger inmates. The fire in her eyes had dimmed to a flicker, replaced by a resignation to the routine of incarceration. She watched the State of the Union addresses on the TV, seeing new speakers sit in her chair, wielding her gavel. They spoke of integrity and transparency, using her name as a synonym for the corruption of the past. It was a strange form of immortality, to become the benchmark for what not to do. In the end, the system corrected itself, but the cost was the total destruction of a political dynasty. The Pelosi correction became a term in economics textbooks, describing the market adjustment that occurs when insider advantages are removed. The playing field had been leveled, not by policy, but by prosecution. And in the silence of Cell Block B, the former Speaker of the House finally understood the true cost of the trade. The lesson had been harsh, absolute, and irreversible. She closed her eyes, listening to the guard's footsteps echoing down the hall, the rhythm of a justice system that never sleeps. The game was over. The positions were closed, and the account was finally settled.